I think now it's the time for us to get started. So today we're very lucky, we're very happy to have three authors here today to discuss China's China's overseas lending. So Sebastian and Christoph, they're going to do a joint presentation, and the Q&A part where Carmen is going to join us as well. So just to first announce some ground rules, in the first 15 minutes, you can submit your clarifying questions using the chat feature. And the co-authors might decide to just reply right away in chat, or we may decide to interrupt the speaker to ask those clarifying questions for everybody. And during the Q&A, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature. Then we'll have a moderate discussion. All right, so the floor is yours. Sebastian, please get started.
Christoph will start actually, but...
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, we'll stop, yeah.
All right.
So thanks so much for the kind invitation and for allowing us to present our work, which is part of a bigger research agenda on official international lending. So think of it as lending between two independent states, say the government A to government B, or between two central banks. And China has emerged as the dominant official lender of our time. In fact, the motivation for this project was that we know so little about China's impact in global finance. I should add that all views are personal and do not reflect those of the institutions we are affiliated with. As a means of motivation, you know that there's a large literature on the trade shock from China, but there's much less corresponding work on China's finance shock. So the impact of China's rise in the global financial system. We know at the same time, however, that China's footprint is growing. Cheruti et al. Have a paper showing that Chinese state-owned banks now provide one-fourth, of bank lending to emerging markets. We know that the Chinese government has become, as I said, one of the largest official creditors. As we show in this paper, the portfolio of China's state-owned banks and public enterprises lending abroad is now bigger than that of the IMF and bigger than that of the World Bank and bigger than all the Paris Club members combined. So it really has become the main official state lender in the world. We know that many developing countries received significant loans from China. We know that Chinese firms are generally increasingly active overseas, including the private sector and the financing side. So we look at the lending out of China, and Coppola, Maggiore, Neiman, and Traeger, they look at how Chinese firms finance themselves abroad, including by tax haven. But overall, there is a missing big picture on China's role in the international system. And just to motivate or to show you the size of China's lending and how it evolved, look at this graph, which shows you loans and trade credits over the past 20 years in % of world GDP. So you can see that the amounts have considerably increased especially since the global financial crisis. Outstanding loans as of 2018 are almost 600 billion, trade credits 700 billion. Many of these trade credits are long run credits, so it's sometimes hard to distinguish between loans and trade credits. So we know that there has been a very large lending boom of China, especially to developing countries. What we don't know, however, are much details behind this overall trend. So the problem in analyzing China's spillovers in lending, the overseas lending of China, is a lack of transparency. So China does not share the amounts, the destination, or the terms of these loans that are extended by mostly Chinese state-owned banks and any other Chinese government entities. So we don't know where this money is going, how large the amounts are to each country, and what the terms are, the currency, the maturity, the interest rates, etc., etc. And that makes it very hard to analyze the implications and to understand this phenomenon in the first place. And that was the starting point of this project. What we did was to create a consensus database, puzzling together a large variety of different data sources that Sebastian will present later. So I will, after this short introduction and motivation, will hand over to Sebastian, who will show you the stylized facts. And then I will conclude by looking at the implications. Okay, so this database that Sebastian will present in detail creates a new resource to understand the size, destination, and characteristics of China's global lending. We have a focus on lending to developing countries, but we also gathered all data that we could on lending to and capital exports to advanced countries. The main insights from our analysis are threefold. First, Chinese lending is not fully captured by the gold standard data sources we all have been using. So if you go to the international debt statistics of the World Bank or the IMF, then a large share of this lending is not captured. We estimate that about 50% of total Chinese lending to the developing world is unreported in the main data sets we have been using. So why is that? There are a variety of reasons. Sebastian will give you a few more details, but a central problem is that China is not part of the Paris Club of other official creditors, so it does not share data like the other Paris Club members. It's also not part of the OECD club of trade creditors, which have disclosure requirements. And China itself is not reporting on details on its lending activities. When you look at rating agencies or data firms like Bloomberg, then the problem is that they focus mostly on private lending. But this official lending by Chinese banks, by Chinese state-owned banks, literally falls through the cracks, and so do credit events, right? So this is one main reason why this data has not been captured. Another reason is the very specific type of lending China pursues. So China lends oftentimes not to the government itself, but to a state-owned enterprise, say in Mozambique or Angola, okay? And many of these countries in the developing world do not have statistical procedures that capture the lending of these state-owned enterprises, so that this lending is not captured and that's not reported to the World Bank and the IMF. That's one of the main drivers among several. So we find that a significant chunk of this big lending boom of China is not captured. We call this hidden debt, and this has consequences. It has consequences for international surveillance work. So think of that sustainability analysis. One of the central ingredients to any solid analysis is to know how large the debt stocks are and how large the payment obligations are vis-a-vis the various creditors. And China is missing in part from that picture. It also has implications for payment seniority, right? So if you think about a pecking order of sovereign debt repayment, so who do you repay first? The bondholders, the banks, other official creditors of China. It's of course an issue for those other creditors not to know what credits are serviced and when towards China. Has major implications for the international financial architecture, and also from a private investor perspective, of course, it's very relevant to know how much loans are actually outstanding in each country towards this official creditor that is China. We also look at the determinants of official lending, of Chinese capital export, and we emphasize that lending is official, meaning that it does not fit the textbook theory of international capital flows, which is very much focused on private flows. In fact, the drivers differ from what is typically found in the capital flow literature, meaning this global factors are basically absent from as driver of Chinese flows, whereas domestic factors are really important. So that's the plan for today. For the remaining talk is we will first focus on developing countries. That will be the main part that Sebastian will present and is the main part, in fact, of the paper. Then I will take over and talk about the implications for that default in developing countries. And then I will focus on the big picture. Adding swap lines, so the swap lines by the Chinese central banks to the rest of the world, and portfolio investments, so the asset purchases by China's central bank, and that is mostly implications for advanced country debt vis-a-vis China. And finally, say a few words on the determinants of Chinese capital exports. Okay, now I hand over to Sebastian.
If before that, I have just a clarifying question. You say that this increase in the lending really started after the great financial crisis. That's where we can really see this increase, while the net capital outflows from China, they rather tend to flatten or even decrease. Is there any reason why this increase happens then, or why you have this really sharp increase? And most of your study is about the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So one reason, the biggest reason is the growth in Chinese GDP, right? Sebastian will show you a graph that as a share of GDP, the increase in lending of Chinese GDP, right? So China is not exporting so much more capital vis-a-vis the size of its own economy. It's just that the size of its own economy has grown so much, right? That's one main reason behind this increase. The other is that there has been, so China reacted to the financial crisis by exporting overcapacity. So often these loans are given as package deals where, a construction firm builds a project abroad, or an energy investment and commodity products. And this project that is then built by Chinese firms is financed with from a Chinese state-owned bank, right? So part of this was overcapacity exported, and part of it was also political. So there's kind of a going global strategy by the Chinese government of going abroad. Maybe Sebastian has 1 or 2 points more to add on that.
So I'll get to a graph that I think will be helpful in clarifying the points you just made. If that's okay, I'll just, well, as Christoph said, at the core of the project is the attempt to create an encompassing database of Chinese overseas lending, of all the lending transactions of the Chinese state-owned creditors. And over the course of the next 15 minutes or so, I'll try to walk you through the sources we use to create this database, and also comment on the methodology that we employ in order to estimate the outstanding debt stocks. So if we look at the recipient side of the transaction, then I'll also then go into detail on what we do in order to estimate and quantify the amount of hidden debt that Christoph mentioned. So by that we simply mean the part of the outstanding liabilities that is not captured by the standard databases of international debt. So to start, just want to make clear that we are not the first to try to collect micro-level data on Chinese overseas lending. There are in fact a whole number of existing and very interesting data sources that we build on. What these data sources, these are usually academics or policy institutes. What they do is, since China itself doesn't publish any loan level information on its overseas lending, they go to the ground, they look at Chinese embassies, the press releases of Chinese embassies, they look at annual reports of recipient country corporations, they look at annual reports of contractors such as construction companies, and try to basically infer bits and pieces on Chinese lending transactions. And then they verify these transactions by looking at different independent sources and publish data sets, and we build heavily on this sort of data. The key issue with the existing databases that we have listed here is that they are scattered with respect to their geographic and time coverage. So there's an excellent database, for example, on Africa by the Johns Hopkins China-Africa Research Initiative. There's a separate database on Chinese overseas loans into energy sectors by Boston University. There's also one data set by William and Mary, the Chinese official finance data set, which comes closest to global coverage. It covers lending transactions by Chinese state-owned creditors to a bit more than 100 recipient countries. The problem with this data set is that it ends in 2014, so it misses much of the lending spree that has been associated with China's Belt and Road Initiative. So these sources are incomplete. So what we're doing here is that essentially we embark on a very extensive merging and cleaning exercise. We are drawing data from all of these sources and then work through, well, over several thousand project descriptions. We try to get rid of duplicates. Whenever we encounter conflicting information, we try to reconcile it and then merge all of these transactions into our consensus database, as we call it, which covers around 5,000 Chinese official loans and grants from pretty much the foundation of the People's Republic all the way to 2017. And again, Christoph emphasized that, but just to be very clear, by official, we basically mean all loans that are extended by Chinese state-owned creditors. So you can think of Chinese state-owned banks such as China Development Bank, the China Export-Import Bank, but also state-owned enterprises in the construction sector, for example, and also China's commercial but state-owned banks such as ICBC or the Bank of China. Total commitments in our data set add up to around 520 billion USD. And what's important later on when you try to estimate the outstanding debt stocks, we not just gather the lending amounts, but also try to gather all available information on interest rates, maturities, grace period, and the currency denomination.
Sebastian, one clarifying question
sure.
here from the audience. Is the currency largely in USD or Chinese RMB, or what type of mixture are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you. So these are just basically the foundational data set, and I'll just give you a few stylized facts on how it looks, including some summary statistics on the terms of the loans and their currency denomination. So we'll get there in a minute, and then I can give you more details on that. So if we turn to the next slide, Christoph, an interesting fact that emerges from our exercise is that China actually has always been a very active international lender. What you're seeing here, the red bars, are aggregate Chinese annual commitments to the rest of the world according to our data, and these amounts are scaled by Chinese GDP. So that's on the left axis, and you can see Chinese outward lending by state-owned creditors has always been relatively high, even in the 1950s and 60s, when China itself was facing considerable hardship domestically. What has really changed over the course of time, and that's the dashed black line that you can see here, is that China's share of global GDP has risen substantially. So it has risen from, that's on a purchasing power parity weighted basis, it has risen from around 5% of global GDP to a bit more than 15%. And of course, as a result of this growth and importance, the global ramification of its overseas lending have strongly risen. There's another thing that you can see here. If you look at the turn of the century, you see an upward tick that represents China's going global strategy, in the context of which, well, the banks, but also the enterprises were encouraged to go global, to export into new overseas markets. And as a result, the lending volumes also went up. Another thing that has changed, and that is the next slide, is that the global reach of Chinese lending operations has really broadened over the past decades. If we can look at the next slide, exactly what you're seeing here, the red line is the share of developing and emerging countries that have received Chinese official finance within a span of 5 years. And we are contrasting that blue dashed line to the recipients of US official finance. And you can see that this lending in the 1950s and 60s went to a very small set of countries, mostly communist allies, few select communist brother states within the Sino-Soviet bloc or in the third world. But over the course of the past decade, the global reach of Chinese lending has really widened. So recipients of US official finance, this basically covers the entire globe, but as you can see, the gap towards the coverage of Chinese overseas lending has really closed, has become more narrow in recent years. Now let me turn to the terms of the loans. As I said, these are very important for us because we use them to map the loans into outstanding debt stocks, but they themselves are quite interesting actually, and I'll get to the question regarding the currency denomination. So first of all, as we have emphasized, this is official finance in the sense that it is extended by state-owned creditors, but that doesn't mean that we are looking at concessional flows or at some sort of development assistance in the traditional sense of the OECD term. So in fact, around 60% of the loans in our data set are commercial in the sense that they're extended at market or close to market interest rates, usually LIBOR plus a margin of 2 or 3%. Just around 15% is concessional in the sense that it has large grant elements and resembles the traditional development assistance, for example, extended by the US government. Another very interesting and fairly unique feature for an official creditor is the widespread use of collateral. Here we are showing an estimate from, not from ourselves, but from a paper by Preutigam and Gallagher, that estimate based on Chinese lending to Latin America and Africa that around 50% of Chinese loans are collateralized. The way this usually works is that the recipient, very often a state-owned enterprise, sets up an escrow or special account abroad, and usually in some sort of offshore financial center, and then transfers proceeds from commodity exports or from an underlying commercial project into this account. And in the case of default, the Chinese creditor can access this account to basically service its outstanding claims. That's quite unique for an official creditor and obviously has very important implications for the seniority structure. A final point, let me come to the currency denomination. I think that answers the initial question. In our sample, and we were surprised to see that, around 70% of all loans are denominated in US dollars. So initially, when we started working on this project, we also had some sort of renminbi internationalization story in mind, and this doesn't seem to be the primary motivation here. Only around 10 to 15% of the loans that we have identified are actually denominated in renminbi. So I see there's a question on the duration of the commercial loans. I can say a few words on maturity. Usually the maturity on these loans is a bit shorter than comparable maturities on World Bank lending. So usually we're talking about 15 to 20 years in years to maturity. And we don't have any evidence.
Can you follow up a bit on the currency? Audience are interested if there is a time trend over time in terms of the currency denomination.
We don't see that in our data, no. It seems to be fairly constant. So taken together, I mean, these obviously have interesting implications for the balance sheets of the recipients, collateralized commercial terms, US dollar dominated, and Christoph will have a few more words to say on that. Before I hand back over to him, I just want to briefly explain to you how we use this information in terms of the loans to map the flows into stocks. So far, what I've shown you are flows. These are loans and grants. But ultimately, in particular, with respect to debt sustainability, what we're interested in are the corresponding debt levels. So how indebted have the recipient countries become towards Chinese state-owned creditors. And again, as Christoph has emphasized, China itself does not publish a geographic breakdown of overseas debt claims. So what we're doing here is that we're using the data on loans in combination with data on maturities, grace period, currencies to compute loan-specific repayment schedules for all loans in our data set since 2000. This is when basically this data on the terms of the loans becomes available. We do that for around 1,500 loans. And then we add up the outstanding amounts according to our estimates by country. And as a result, we have published a data set of debt owed to Chinese official creditors for 107 countries since 2000. And yeah, you can all download this data on one of our websites. One key insight is that as a result of this lending boom on the recipient side, many developing and emerging countries have become highly indebted to Chinese state-owned creditors. We estimate for the 50 countries that are the most indebted that bilateral debt to China, and that is from direct lending only, has risen from around 1% of GDP in 2000 to a bit more than 15% of GDP on average in 2017. So there has been a massive increase at the recipient side, and there are around 24 developing countries that are highly indebted to China alone. If we turn to the next slide, we can just give you an overview of the geographic distribution of these estimated debt stocks. I don't want to go into much detail on individual country statistics, but again, you can go to our website and download this data if you're interested. What might be even more interesting if we look at the aggregate debt claims by China and compare them to other creditors, and that's shown on the next slide. Where you can see here, basically, if we add up all outstanding debts to Chinese state-owned creditors over our sample of 107 countries, you get the red line that shows outstanding Chinese debt claims to the public sector in developing and emerging countries. We can compare that to official statistics on the claims of the World Bank, all Paris Club governments, and the IMF. And you can see that China, by a fairly wide margin, has become the world's largest official creditor. So as Christoph mentioned in the introduction, its outstanding claims exceed those of all 22 Paris Club governments combined. It exceeds those of the World Bank and those of the IMF.
If I may come in a second here, this is actually an enormous issue at the moment. It's enormous. As many of you know, in early May, these 73 countries that are classified as IDA, these are the lowest income countries. This is also where the borrowing from China is concentrated. So this is called the Debt Standstill Initiative, DSSI. DSSI went into effect, and the idea was that during the COVID crisis, debt payments to bilateral official creditors would be suspended for a period of 6 years. And the issue of opacity that we're highlighting in this paper has enormous import, because not only China is by far the largest creditor and bigger than all the other bilaterals combined, there is no clarity on what is considered official. What we consider official has varied over time, meaning the China Development Bank, which is state bank, according to the authorities, the Chinese authorities, they do not view that as official, even though, you know, the private activity is a very recent vintage. But suffice it to say, if you don't get the China Development Bank on board, because of these sheer magnitudes that Sebastian has been talking about, the debt suspension initiative doesn't have as many, you know, as big an impact as it could. It doesn't have as many teeth as it can. So it's a very big issue at the moment also. Interrupt Sebastian.
No worries, all good. yeah, maybe a few final remarks on the estimates. If we look at the next slide, so the question, of course, is we estimate this from microdata. So the question is, how good are these estimates? Once we have estimated outstanding debt stocks, what we do is a wide range of benchmarking exercises where we compare our estimates of outstanding debt in the aggregate to all the bits and pieces of available information that we can get from Chinese creditors. So we compare aggregate external debt to China, according to our estimates, to outstanding claims in China's international investment position. We compare it to the balance sheets and annual reports of the most important creditor banks. And you can see a couple of these benchmarks on the slide. I don't want to go into every single detail, but just emphasize that the key issue here is that we do not capture all of China's lending. So by most benchmarks, we underestimate the outstanding claims and capture only around 60% of the outstanding debt stocks. So it's very difficult to really track down all the relevant lending. And in that sense, our estimates need to be considered as some sort of conservative lower bound.
I have one question. You don't use anywhere balance of payments data from the recipient countries. Can't you get information there?
No, we haven't done that. I think it would only make sense in some very small countries where China is really by far the most important creditor. For most other countries, you have a lot of inflows from different types of creditors, so there wouldn't be enough specific information of Chinese lending itself. It's very difficult to basically isolate Chinese lending from all the other components that appear there.
Okay.
If we jump back, and before I hand over to Christoph's part, let me say a few words on how we quantify hidden debt, the hidden debt that Christoph mentioned initially. So what we mean by hidden debt is simply the part of the outstanding debt stocks that is not captured in official debt statistic. And one observation that jumps up if you look at our estimates, they're high in comparison to the official debt statistics of many of these recipient countries. And there's long been, as Carmen mentioned, given the lack of creditor statistics and the general intransparency, there's long been speculation about unreported liabilities. And one reason for that is that Chinese lending coincides with existing reporting gaps in the official debt statistics of the recipient countries. A large share of Chinese lending goes to state-owned enterprises. So it goes to the mining sector, to the infrastructure sector, to the energy sector, and is taken up not so much by the central government often, but by special purpose vehicles or state-owned enterprises. And very often in low-income countries, simply due to governance issue or lack of statistical capacity, the liabilities of these entities are not reported. They do not enter the official debt statistics of the public sector. And to be clear, that is a reporting gap that is not limited to China. That also appears if a Western commercial bank lends to these entities. A key issue here, of course, is that China, as Christoph has mentioned initially, is not part of the OECD or the Paris Club, does not publish creditor statistics, so it doesn't share information on its own that could help to uncover the outstanding claims and liabilities. So what we do in the paper here is that we try to quantify how sizable the underreporting problem is. We again follow some sort of meta-analysis that essentially resembles a bit of an older literature on capital flight, in which researchers looked, for example, at the export data of an exporter and compared it to the import data of an importer, and then searched for systematic discrepancies. And we're doing something very similar here by just comparing with different statistics, different official statistics, say, on the same Chinese lending transactions, and then try to figure out where systematic differences arise. Most importantly, what we do in the paper is that we compare our data on Chinese lending to a confidential extract from the World Bank's debtor reporting system. So in case you're not familiar with that, if a country borrows from the World Bank, it is required to report every new loan it takes up to the World Bank through the debt reporting system, and the World Bank then uses this data to compile the international debt statistics. So what we can do here is we simply basically check how much has the public sector of a given developing country received in Chinese lending according to our data collection, and then compare it to the amount of Chinese lending that this country has reported to the World Bank. And a key insight that emerges is, Christoph has already said it in the beginning, that around 50% of Chinese lending to the public sector in developing and emerging countries is not included in this standard World Bank database. So the data is confidential, so we cannot show a detailed country by country breakdown, but you can see here that around, well, 50% is not included, and this amounts to around 200 billion USD as of 2016. So we're using the international debt statistic version of 2018 here, so the series ends in 2016. Then again, once we have the unreported loans, we can ask on a country level, how high are the hidden debt stocks, how high are the magnitudes here, and we again map flows into stocks by using the available information on the maturities and repayment schedules. And we're showing you here, again, because we cannot show the actual numbers for single countries, we're showing you a frequency distribution, again, for the 50 most indebted countries. And you can see that, first of all, for the bottom half of this hidden debt frequency, the debt statistics do not change that much. So for around 25 countries in this group, there are only minor adjustments. So for the median country, the debt statistics look pretty decent. But then if we move to the upper end of the distribution, we see that for around 24 developing countries, the true extent of indebtedness towards China is underestimated by, well, 5, 10, even 15 or 20% of GDP. So for developing countries, these are pretty massive, massive amounts. And with that, I'll hand back over to Christoph, who will, give us a bit more on what this implies.
Okay, thanks so much. So in the second part of the paper, we then ask, what are the implications of this for the recipient countries? In particular, is there a risk that this lending, part of it being unreported, might be a reason for debt distress? In other words, is there a new debt crisis brewing in countries indebted to China? And we asked that question, well, when we came out with the paper, and by now, I think the part of it has already been answered. The unexpected corona shock has indeed meant that the number of countries in debt distress, including the poorest countries, has increased substantially in the past 6 months. And China's debt plays a major role in this whole debate. So in that sense, the question indeed has been partly answered, but nevertheless give you some context of what we look at in the paper. We draw parallels to the last major debt crisis of developing countries in the 1980s, and there are striking parallels indeed. So what you can see here is the median debt to GDP, the black line. Public and publicly guaranteed debt as percent of country GDP. And the dotted blue line shows you a commodity price index, which with details in the paper. But what you can see is that there was a veritable lending boom in the 1970s, often to countries that were commodity exporters, often to countries that were that hadn't had access to financing for decades before that. Many of them low income. The lending of what were mostly syndicates of Western commercial banks was largely opaque. There was no institution collecting this data. The terms of the lending were not publicly known. In fact, the Institute for International Finance was founded in reaction to this opacity problem of during this global debt boom to the developing world of the 70s. We see debt to GDP numbers increasing substantially, and then during the crisis increasing further. The debt crisis was painful. Almost more than 50 developing countries went into default, and the debt to GDP numbers stayed high. It took almost 20 years to clean this up. In the 2000s, in the wake of several debt relief initiatives, HIPC, multilateral debt relief initiative, etc., is part of the story. Favorable growth conditions and rising commodity prices were another reason for this decline in debt to GDP in developed countries. And in recent years, however, we've seen a increase again in debt to GDP on average in developing countries. We know this number is increasing further with all the corona impact of the corona crisis, the rising expenditures, the dropping revenues. We are on the way up here. And once we consider, and this is the added value here, once we consider hidden debt, this matters for about the 20 to 25 countries that Sebastian has said. Here we just add the scale of hidden debt in the dark red areas, the upper decile, right? So think about this for about a dozen countries. The debt numbers look much worse and look like and clearly are in debt distress territory once you take into account China's hidden debts. So we pointed to this serious problem, which is not true for the median country where Chinese hidden debt is not such an issue, but for those 25 dozen developing countries where it is important, it has major implications for its sustainability. And indeed, the parallels to the 1970s and 80s are striking. So let's hope this time around the workout of this crisis will not take as long. It will not be as painful as it has been. What I also
one question: shouldn't the systemic implications be different in that case? Because if it's only for very small countries, less developed countries, so and it does not concern the market. It's just China and very small countries. So the spillovers should be quite different from the previous crisis.
So a couple of things. Small is relative, right? Ecuador's restructuring, which, has had quite a bit of, not contagion in the sense because it was, for the kind of contagious things, for financial contagion, necessarily market size isn't the key determinant. Thailand was comparatively small and yet triggered a massive Asian crisis. So Ecuador is an example of what one would call a middle-income country with a lot of China exposure. Venezuela used to be a middle-income country. That's no longer the case. That they had a very big China exposure. Other countries that have been in the press with difficulties: Pakistan, Angola, Nigeria has some, not as much as others. So you are talking about not, this is not the BRICS, it's not Brazil, it's not India, but a very significant share of countries having exposure. So it's not across the board, but it is, it is a very significant number of countries that have exposure. I would add, it is beyond the scope of this paper, but a very recent trend, as in the last couple of years, as commodity prices have come down, as some of these countries, as Christoph was saying, moved closer to debt distress levels or are in debt distress already, China has shifted gears also to higher income countries. So we've seen, more activity in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. It's definitely moving up the income scale in its overseas lending. This is beyond the scope of this paper, but it is the natural follow-up to what we're presenting here.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I will also talk about swap lines, which is another element here that we shouldn't forget. I mean, we're just presenting developing country lending here. The lending relationship out of China to emerging markets take various forms, as Carmen said. What we didn't know when we started the project is how many restructurings there have been, right? Just like the loans themselves, also the defaults and the restructurings fall through the cracks of international reporting, fall through the cracks of rating agency. There is simply not a systematic, there's no agency responsible to covering this, so it's all researcher based. And what we've done here is to plot the number of restructurings with private creditors, right? This is on the vertical axis from the Christoph Trebesch data set. And we compare this from data that is available from the 2000s onward with restructuring on Chinese loans. And you can see that there are, in comparison, many more restructurings on Chinese loans, including, some emerging markets, Ecuador, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, Venezuela, and the number was surprisingly high. We know very little, unfortunately, about the details of this, and more research needs to be done in trying to understand what the substance of these restructurings are, how the terms are. It looks like most of these are Paris Club style restructurings. Paris Club in the 1980s, meaning that just maturities were extended, but no reductions in face value occurred, and rarely interest rate reductions. So this is mostly kicking down the can type restructurings. But again, the terms and systematic evidence is not available. The more concessional the deal, the easier it is to get information. But the CDB deals and all that is very hard to get details on.
So just on that very note, the recent Ecuador restructuring, which involved substantive loans from both, China and Export-Import Bank, but more importantly, the China Development Bank. The terms of that restructuring is very much along the lines of what Christoph described. Maturities were extended. In the context of COVID, there was a grace period offered on payments of principal, but not interest. So, and the market rates of, not quite as extreme as, say, what this El Salvador bond, was 9.5%. It's not quite at that extreme, but their market rates, they're close to 7%. So, interest rates were maintained, maturities were lengthened. There was some element of grace period on the principal, but not on the interest. So that is kind of typical of what we've seen thus far on the type of restructuring. Very reluctant. We saw this in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen it in the case of Pakistan, very reluctant to have face value reductions.
So in that sense, it's very much like a typical official creditor. Like the Paris Club was very reluctant to agree to any kind of face value reductions as well, but they didn't ask for the same level of interest, right? So that China lends like a private creditor, but then when it comes to debt distress and restructuring, it behaves more like an official creditor. But again, it's hard to nail what I just said down, because we simply do not have the exact terms of all these deals, but that's how, the information we do have looks like. So part of this, missing restructurings of China that we've gathered, and that others have also, there's additional work currently coming out on restructurings of China, but all of them missing the very details one would need to calculate haircuts, for example. But nevertheless, part of these restructurings solve a puzzle we have encountered in related work, and that is the puzzle of the curious case of missing defaults. So we have a paper, Carmen and Vincent Reinhardt, where we look at the circumstances of major global default waves. So the black line is the famous Reinhard Rogoff share of countries entering default in each year over the past 200 years. Okay, so you see the major default spikes, after the Napoleonic Wars and the Latin American independence wave. You see the 1890s wave. You see the interwar and the 1980s debt crisis. And we in that paper, the novelty is that we combine this with data on commodity prices and global commodity prices and global capital flows. And wherever there is a double bust, what we call it, so a decline in capital flow, a reversal in global capital flows, think of a global sudden stop, when that decline in capital flows coincides with the decline in commodity prices, we call this a double bust, right? A double shock. And those are the shaded red lines. What you can see is that most of these global default waves were preceded by a double bust, so a double shock to capital flows and commodity prices. The puzzle is that we had that kind of double bust since the early 2010s, as commodity prices declined and capital flows to the rest of the world declined as well. But what we didn't see is an uptick in default. So if we look at the default as counted by Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and all these other sources that mostly focus on private creditors, there is no uptick. Once we account for the Chinese restructurings, the picture changes. So we do see somewhat of an uptick. And in fact, now, once we consider not only China, but also other official creditors, we are likely to see a wave of default. That's just the question of how large it is. Whether it will be small or large will depend on, of course, on the evolution of the ongoing shock. And there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, so it's hard to make predictions. But we certainly enrich the picture by taking into account not just these private flows, but also Chinese flows and credit events. So let me turn to the last part, which is focused on the geography of China's lending beyond developing countries, and also takes into account the full menu of China's lending, including the large-scale asset purchases by the PBOC, and FDI debt. So there was a question in the chat, in fact. Oftentimes, Chinese FDI are in fact loans that look more like disguised FDI contracts. There's a lot of, they actually look like debt contracts, but they are entitled as FDI. So these are called FDI debt. I mean, other countries have these kind of flows as well, but in China it certainly plays a role as well. So we consider bond purchases FDI, and we consider swap lines. So Ricardo Rice in the last seminar presented fascinating evidence on the swap lines of China with the rest of the world. China has arranged swap lines with 40 countries by now on amounts of more than $500 billion US. So these are no small numbers, and we have traced the outstanding credits whenever we could by going to central bank by central bank and try to follow the actual flows that go through the swap lines. And once we add all of this together, we move from this picture that Sebastian shows you to a broader picture, just to show you the size of this in comparison. We have talked pretty much, the entire talk up to now was on the red shaded area, so the direct loans. We now add all of this, including trade credit to advanced countries, and the substantial PBOC sovereign bond buying, the sovereign wealth fund purchases, and by state-owned banks. So portfolio purchases of sovereign bonds of emerging markets, but importantly also advanced countries. And once we do that, we see from the balance of payments statistics that we exceed a stock of 6% of world GDP by now. So the lending boom has not just gone to developing countries, but it has implications for the rest of the world as well. Once we add all of these different instruments together, we get this map. So we in the paper, we outline how it's harder to get detailed information on the PBOC holdings. We adopt a number of approximation exercises. So for whatever data we could get, for example, from the IMF Coordinated Portfolio Investment Survey. And this is the graph you get. So this is adding developing country loans, trade credits, POVC swap lines, and portfolio holdings by the POVC. And you see that once you do that, the share of credits to the claims to the rest of the world is high, not just towards developed countries, but also towards advanced countries. So if you take into account the large amounts of Bund holdings, for example, then Germany is indebted with more than 10% of GDP towards China. So that's a substantial amount via, of course, these traded bonds. Mm-hmm.
One important, I think, footnote on this is, you know, or not a footnote actually, but expanding on this. Initially, meaning when our sample starts, around when our sample starts in 2000, the PBOC was almost exclusively accumulating reserves, and it was tantamount to buying US Treasuries. By, you know, 2013, even before that, there may have been already even before all the China-US trade wars and tensions, there may have been a saturation point on, you know, exposure to treasuries. So after the global financial crisis, we see actually China begin to purchase more non-US. And part of that non-US was a Europe story, but an important part is also middle-income countries, countries like Malaysia, like Chile, that do not register as big borrowers in terms of loans, are exposed via portfolio flows. So, you know, the idea of an abrupt reversal in China's capital flows is not confined to the low-income countries that, you know, we've been highlighting in the loans.
Yes, I can only second that. So a sudden stop by China would have large systemic implications, not just for, you know, Tonga and Mozambique. It would have much bigger implications for not just emerging markets, but also advanced countries. So since time is running out, let me wrap up by giving just a brief insight into our analysis on the determinants of capital flows, outflows out of China. We, for this purpose, we adopt the exact same estimation framework as in Ray and Bruno and Shin's work. So we estimate these VARs with recursive indication, Cholesky ordering, and find, you know, to boil it down, these global factors seem to matter much less than if we look at private flows, or if you look at, you know, US related capital flows, whereas domestic factors, especially GDP growth of China, is a key driver of capital outflows from China. And just to give you a sense of the results, this is the impulse response from a real GDP growth shock of China. So we find a substantial effect on gross capital outflows, whereas the effect on a shock, a VIX shock, is not significant. We do find some effect on commodity price shock. So China's capital exports seem to be partly driven by this type of global shock, although of course China has a big part in driving commodity prices, and the Chinese monetary policy stance itself is not significant either. So it's really GDP growth that from this exercise seems to be the key driver. And in this sense, if we think about the systemic implications of the ongoing crisis, the substantial drop in Chinese growth, relatively speaking, is not so much because relatively speaking, they look more dynamic than much of the rest of the world, but still you've seen a substantial decline in GDP growth. And if you extrapolate the results from this exercise, it would mean that we will see less outflows out of China in the ongoing crisis. Of course, there might be other factors driving this, political factors, overcapacity, as I said before. But that's certainly one factor to keep in mind, that domestic GDP has been a key driver of Chinese capital export in the past. So let me wrap up.
Sorry, a quick question.
Yeah.
You showed the evidence about total gross flows, but you started your talk, and most of the talk was about these loans. And these loans, they keep increasing even though China has lower growth. Have you also tried to understand these the developments behind these loans, and not just the total gross flows?
Mm-hmm. Sebastian, you want to answer?
I can chime in, yeah. So we are still in the process of looking at the driver of the loans at the country level. So basically, now that we have the data set, we're starting to explore determinants in the cross-country section. Just a quick comment on your point that these loans keep increasing. I don't think that is actually the case. So what we have been seeing over the course of the past 2 or 3 years is a fairly marked decline in lending to Latin America, for example. So I think the highest point in overseas direct lending was reached in 2014 and 15. In that sense, this is consistent with what Christoph has presented on domestic GDP growth being a main driver of the outflow dynamics.
And let me add that, and this is related also to one of the questions we got from the participants. Can you discuss the drivers of this lending, political ambition or investment return? In terms of drivers, as we've highlighted here, China's growth is really a double. China's growth was pivotal in actually generating the longest commodity boom that we've seen since 1790. I mean, this is in the work that Christoph has already referenced, with Christoph and Vincent on capital flows, in which we also look at the long commodity cycles. China's growth averaged about over 10% between 2003 and 2013. What that did for global commodity prices in terms of sustaining them at a very high level for an extended period of time, a long cycle, not just a big cycle, but a long cycle, was very significant. So, and Christoph mentioned this earlier, in terms of push, the factor of China growth is, even though we try to control for this, it's kind of in the same bag as the commodity story. Very, very high commodity prices also are driven by China's double-digit growth and high commodity demands. The growth at that time, remember, was very investment-centric, which is much more intensive on primary metals, energy, and other such commodities. Also important on the push side, and this is where I think is our weakest area in this work. Also on the push side is the issue of geopolitical considerations, okay? Whether the race to bring in countries within your domain of influence, that is something we need to do more work on, okay? But in terms of the more classic push and pull stories, I think our takeaway is that in the case of Chinese lending, growth / commodities played you know, a more dominant role than the financial variables that are so critical for private flows. Okay, one final note, and Christoph mentioned this, but I'm just reiterating because it's a really important point. On the not push side, but on the pull side, on the country recipients, the HIPC initiative was extremely important in that it cleaned out the balance sheet of many countries. So a lot of these countries started out with little or no external debt after the HIPC initiative had wiped that out, which made them very, you know, you couple, oh, they have their commodity exporter, they export, you know, oil, or they export cocoa, and commodity prices are high, they have low external debt, they're a great catch. That was no longer the case by 2015. So as Sebastian said, you know, since 2015, we've seen a very significant diminishing pace of flows to these countries. And that also jives with the fact that in the last 5 years, many of those countries have already entered debt difficulties, debt distress, or are very close to it if they were not already there at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, seeing my conclusions, I think we've already talked about pretty much all of this in the discussion. So let me wrap up, and thank you already for the many questions. What is clear is that more work needs to be done. We see our paper as just one step in shedding light on the broad characteristics, the size, the destination of this. Many of the questions in the chat were trying to, you know, get more information, drilling deeper. How do these contracts look? How does collateral look? What are the granular drivers? That's not part of here, but I think there is much more to be done, not just because of the size of this in terms of financial volumes, but also because, of course, all these geopolitical implications that are first order here. Thanks.
If I may just add one last point, I think in the period ahead, also, this is an issue that's going to be very important, because we really haven't had the opportunity to address this, but restructurings are going to be different because collateralized lending already introduces seniority into the picture in a way that we had not seen, certainly not from official lenders before. You know, Paris Club type lending is certainly concessional and is certainly not associated with collateral. So, you know, the other leg of it, you know, we've seen the upswing. Now on the downswing side, the restructurings, we are also going to be seeing a very different type of you know, restructuring dynamics.
Great, thanks so much. We have a couple of Q&A questions lined up. So first of all, Tom Hancock, do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I know there's been a lively debate about this paper since the original research came out, and one of the respondents, I think Deborah Brautigam at Hopkins, wrote a blog post that was quite interesting in April. And she was arguing that some of the data was maybe not accurate, maybe counting commitments rather than disbursements, and I think she had a couple of other criticisms. So I was wondering if the authors have read Bradigan's response, and if they have a response to her response.
Sure. So okay, maybe, I don't know, Carmen, you want to go, or? Well, I can be very quick. I mean, we've written a long response, which is was published on the CGD website, so the Center for Global Development. And in response, Deborah has taken down Professor Breutigam has taken down the blog post and replaced it. So we had a long exchange. there was a misunderstanding on some of the original data that they criticized. So the disagreement between the data that she saw, that this team saw, was actually not there. That's the main point. There are still some discrepancies, but in general, their data has been very important for our own estimates. We very closely compared their estimates to our own. So I think there is not that much of a difference. And if you look at the newer version of the blog post, that's very much, you know, the sense there. They have done amazing work, and we've benefited from them. What they haven't done is to transform this into debt to GDP. So that, I think, is something that our paper is really doing. We've also brought the picture to not just Africa, but all these other regions, and added the advanced country perspective. So, but on developing countries, I think we in that blog post you can find on CGD website, you will see a detailed country by country comparison, and we're not far away.
Let me also say that when we were presenting this paper in its very early stages, we presented at the IMF, we presented at the World Bank, and in numerous other places at Harvard, made the point, look, these are commitments. You know, so we actually brought it out to everyone's attention. These are commitments. Now, what we have done is gone overboard to probably overshoot on the other side in terms of just, you know, being very conservative on disbursement schedules that, you know, are very gradual. We've been very conservative at making sure that any loans that we don't have multiple corroboration across databases are not included in the total. So if you ask me what I think these are very much what Sebastian said and what Christoph has said, these are lower bound. Most of the projects we have are skewed towards the longer projects, but there's also short-term trade lending that's much more difficult to capture. China also, you know, there's things like deposits of the PBOC in other central banks that are short-term, and, you know, they're short-term so they don't get counted. They're not part of the data reporting system of DRS. This is all on the lending side. On the portfolio side, we're also very conservative. Especially in recent years, you know, and the Broadigan database doesn't even address this because they're focused on loans and they don't deal with any other type of official lending. You know, the asset purchases of emerging markets has been picking up significantly. So there are many dimensions of this in which, in the experiences, that we've concretely seen, the IMF, when it started with the Democratic Republic of Congo, started with what they thought were debt exposures that ended up being about a third of what they turned out to be. With Pakistan, it wasn't as dramatic, but it was also very much in that direction. These are, you know, it's under, my sense is very much that the errors are all on the downside rather than on the upside.
Great. Next, we have Ellen Ray to ask a question, and then we can have a short answer. Sorry, we're running out of time a bit.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. Given what you said, in particular, Carmen, on the difficulties to restructure when there is lending with collateral, especially with a very powerful official lender, I wonder whether you see a role for the IMF to discourage collateralized lending from China to developing economies who would be in financial distress, especially because of the COVID shock, as a kind of prevention or preventive action?
So the answer is yes. And at the World Bank, it's already started also. You know, the view that, I mean, official debt post-World War II. This is also another paper that Sebastian and Christoph, we've looked at the long history of official debt more broadly. Typically, this collateralization you see in the 19th century official lending, but you don't see it in the modern post-World War II era. So it's more akin to more aggressive private sector lending, and certainly even more aggressive than bondholders, which, you know, it's not does not involve collateral. So yes, the IMF and the World Bank, there's a big drive towards transparency. What does this mean? It's not a catch-all. It means we want to see contracts. You know, we want to see contracts because it's in the revelation of the contracts that you see whether there's collateral. And you know, I think the challenges, and I mentioned DSSI earlier, the challenges going forward for the IMF and for the World Bank are getting not just the private sector on board, which has been, you know, a major problem. It's been also getting the full participation of China and not to consider the China Development Bank as a private entity, which is what the Chinese authorities have said they consider it as, even though it is a public entity. And then there's also the concern that the bilateral creditors, the other bilateral creditors will say, why? Why do we want to give debt forgiveness or agree to any kind of write-down so that the money can be used to repay private creditors or to repay collateralized Chinese debt? So yeah, it all has to come together. The need to get China on board with more bilateral type traditional lending.
Great. All right. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for your participation. And I want to thank the author again for the wonderful discussion. We will see you in 2 weeks. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.